da bimbo, ti chiamo angoscia d'adulto, ma oggi ti guardo e ti chiedo, vuoi ballare con me?
Welcome to Unlearn Roundtable Discussion Series Episode 1. This is Zoe, and I'm here to introduce a very juicy panel where knowledge, expertise, but mostly embodiment of a heritage unravels possibly more than one identity. We have Silvana Patriarca, professor of history here in New York at Fordham University. Kristal Trotter on Zoom, based in North Carolina, founder of Accento.World, and Stephen Cerulli. He is a PhD candidate in modern history at Fordham University and a researcher at the Calandra Institute, Queen's College. Many of us still struggle to feel accepted in their birthplaces, no matter the passport, the language, no matter how we choose to identify ourselves. What we need to change in order to see a more inclusive sense of nation? A lot. We are here because identity is sacred. Identity as the origins, where we come from, who was walking down this path before us, and what they were about. But mostly, where we belong and stand. As New Yorkers would say, don't front. It is an urge we all have, which often, when it's found, creates closure as strong as a sense of home. The DNA tests had a success to an extent, but in reality, there's so much to do in order to embrace this data, create a true sense of belonging, and towards real integration and equality. Italians are and were always the result of a very intricate blend of ethnicities, and by latest scientific researches, in Europe, Italians have the highest genetic diversity. The gradient of their genetic variability scattered all over the peninsula encloses on a small scale the old genetic variance between southern and continental Europeans. This amazing diversity started to accumulate soon after the late glacial maximum, which ended approximately 19,000 years ago. Have they always been embracing this diversity about themselves and welcomed others? Silvana.
Well, as a historian of the modern period, I would say that a lot depends on the creation of the modern nation and a certain way of creating that nation, which is based on the idea that there is specific people with its own culture, with its own history, and also with its own sort of somatic characteristics, right? A construction that was started more or less at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, and so that created this idea of, a distinct people, and fairly homogeneous in spite of, internal differences. But there was an idea that became dominant eventually in the modern era, right? That there was also a certain homogeneity. But this is actually in contrast to the actual history of the long-term history of the country, which was, in fact, not homogeneous at all. It was a mixture of many different peoples, ethnicities, and so on, that had moved into the peninsula over a long period of time. So it was very, very diverse throughout its history, and it's still very diverse. But the question is, what kind of construction, right, the nationalists, the Italian national patriots in the 19th century and then later, right, if we think also about the aggressive nationalism of the fascists and so on, have created in the minds of many Italians that you can still see today, right, this kind of idea of a pretty, again, unique civilization or unique people. And so this makes very difficult now accepting the change that has been taking place now for quite a while, meaning a big influx of people from non-European countries, because we have to think about the history of the Italian people in the 20th century, which was in the late 19th century, was a history of emigration, right, of Italians leaving and going to other countries in large numbers, in millions, right? This is a very important component of the history of modern Italy. And Italians seem to be reluctant to accept the fact that things are changing, and that now there has been this big influx since the starting in the late 70s and so on of people from non-European countries, and this has created tension and has created, of course, a fodder for this kind of movements which are very sort of strongly anti-immigration, which are now in power. So you see, the answer is complex because the history is complex. And I would say that Italians have to really elaborate and face this kind of new stage in their history, which doesn't mean they're not at the same time also emigrating themselves, because there are a large number of young people in the past 10, 15, or even 20 years who have been leaving Italy. So it's not that Italy has just simply been receiving people, a large influx from abroad, but it's also continuing this historical trend of leaving the country, looking for better opportunities. So it's still there. I mean, it's not gone away, and it's really sort of part of who Italians are people on the move, right? And they should sort of recognize the right to move, right, and to move in to other peoples too, because that's part of their country. But this is not something that sort of works simply, right? This kind of acceptance. Right now, certainly, it's not a phase in which there is that kind of acceptance of diversity. But if we go back to the past, again, to the ancient past, to the Roman past, and we think about the policy of assimilations that an extension of citizenships that the Roman had in their, conquest of Italy and then the Mediterranean. We see, lots of different peoples, communities living together, maybe not always without tensions, but as a matter of fact, being able, right, to live together. So we have to sort of think about different models of communities that existed in the past that can actually be recreated, right, again in new ways in the future. So we should not have a static idea of community, because historically communities have been created in different ways, and we should have enough imagination, right, to imagine again new foundations for communities, right, of peoples, right, and go beyond this idea that is a very recent creation of the nation, right, the nation as something different, unique, culturally sort of stable, right, and static also, right. We should not think about cultures in this kind of static way. So we have a lot to learn from history. And, we have to be able to go beyond the mythologies of the nation, right? Because we have this kind of myths of nations, which are really fairly recent creation, 19th century, 20th century creations. You can also find maybe some origins a bit earlier, depending on which countries you consider. But the big, period of in which myths of nations, of the origins, were elaborated in the 19th century. In the Italian case, of course, is the period of the Risorgimento.
Got it. Kristal.
Well, I think that was beautiful. I think that one of the key words here was imagination, to create community. I think that's what kind of stuck with me the most as Silvana was talking. And I think that there's a huge lack of imagination right now. I just feel that, when you talk about Italy and Italians, there's a lack of imagination, and you can see what lack of imagination brings, which could be very, very dangerous. When you're talking about, like, to answer your question about embracing diversity, I think embrace is a big word. I think we're at the level of acceptance. And from my experience, living in Italy, and I've never witnessed people embracing diversity. I've within, Italians kind of tend to accept diversity when it's in their inner circles, really. So they know the person, they know who they are, they know their family, right? But when it when you have to deal with diversity in terms of another person that may look like me but is not me, then that's a different conversation. I remember growing up, people would call me, I would just be Kristal. I was, Kika or Kristal, right? And that's me. That kind of defined who I was. And there's a form of acceptance there, but then that was it, right? They really didn't know me, really. They knew me, but they didn't know me. They didn't accept my diversity fully, right? They couldn't understand, or they didn't venture out to understand what um, the difficulties of systemic racism or anything like. And that's too. We're talking about racism, but even just to know what I like, right? And I kind of fit into their mold or their perception of who I was, which was Kika, right? That's Kristal. That's it. There's nothing more or nothing less than what we want you to be. And this was friends and family. So I think it's a form of acceptance. We're not at a level of embracing diversity by any means. And then I think that growing up in the North, and having talked to or having spoken to people who live in the southern Italy, I do have a sense of, if we have to talk about accepting diversity, embracing diversity, that there's more acceptance in southern Italy than there is in northern Italy. I have that kind of feeling, but yeah, I think there's a lack of imagination, and we need to do something. We need to be creative in order to create community, because there's no embracing anything at the moment. I think that it's getting to a point where we're actually going backwards, where um, we're not even accepting Italians within Italians, right? It's really going backwards. So let alone having people of diverse backgrounds. Um, and yeah, I think that there's another point I wanted to touch on, but when you were asking about embracing diversity, the first thing that came to mind was regionality. And that was as far as like people, Italians embrace their own regionality. So it's always who I know, who I am, right? And it's like the other regions is not considered. So there's always the sense of competition. There's always the sense of I'm better than you, or or you do this differently than I do. So and I wonder if that is cultural, because there's a tendency to compare ourselves to others, but then again, everyone should be like us within the Italian culture. So it's very difficult to embrace anything, really. So yeah.
Stephen.
So I'm furiously typing away on some notes. So I want to pivot off a couple things that we've discussed already. In terms of the kind of multicultural history of Italy, I'm fully from what was once the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, but from 4 or 5 different current Italian states. In the medieval period, under the Hohenstaufens, I'm totally mispronouncing that, but they were called like the Swabian monarchies. The Kingdom of Sicilies, which was Kingdom of Sicily, just Sicily singular, was a multicultural place. If you went to the court of Frederick II, you would have Arabs, Jewish, people who were Norman, Swabians from Germany. You'd have people from Italy, Sicilians who spoke, Neo-Latin Sicilian, Sicilians who spoke Agallo, Neo-Latin, which is closer to Piemontese or Lombard, right? In the various different types of Neapolitan peoples, whether they be Calabrese, Abruzzese. So there is this kind of historical precedence, right? And we can also think of Tuscany, right? I'm thinking through the years, right? In Cosimo de' Medici, I think the second or third, was like the first person of color head of state in Europe, right? This gives you an idea of that kind of racial inferiority, etc. Comes along later. Even in Italy today, the kind of historic languages dispersed throughout the geography are actually quite diverse, right? The village where I'm from in Puglia, we speak a Franco-Provençal dialect, right? Because our ancestors came from southern France in the 1300s. The village next to us speaks Arbresh, right? You go about 20 kilometers up, you're going to be in Molise, and they're going to be speaking Croat, right? So there is this kind of historical precedence of like multiculturalism, especially in the Italian South. But then you can likewise go to the north, right? Go to Piedmont, you'll have the peripheries of some areas speaking Occitan dialects. When you go closer to Switzerland, they'll be speaking Arpitan Franco-Provençal dialects. You go to a place like the Veneto, you'll have transition zones between Venetian and Lombard, right? You'll have Cimbrians who are speaking a Bavarian German language, right? I just found out Kristal is from Friuli, right? That's a whole other different set of languages, right? Rhaeto-Romance languages. So there is this already existing diversity within Italy that's always been kind of tolerated throughout its history. To Silvana's point about Italy being people on the move, there's a really good book called Italy's Many Diasporas by Donna Gabaccia, and it basically talks about Italian history and Italians being a people who have always went from one place to another, right? And a lot of Italians forget this twofold, right? The internal diasporas that took place, like a great example, again, I'll use my family history, is like my great-great-great-grandparents left Palermo to go to Campania, right? And then they left Campania to go to America, and then they could have stayed there, America, but then my great-grandmother, born in America, but went back to Italy and grew up there, then came back over here, right? And if you go to any of these little villages, even in the north, right, the Veneto saw the first migration waves in the 1850s. You'll find people who will tell stories, mostly the older people who can remember this, of their grandparents that went to Argentina, that went to Brazil, that went to the United States, right? And the Italian-American historian Rudolph Veckley argues that about 51% of the people that came over during the Great Diaspora between 1880 and 1924, when the borders were closed, specifically on Italians, went back to Italy, right, and would become small-scale farmers, shopkeepers, whatever, because they were able to get some economic capital in the United States that they did not have access to in Italy, which we can go over for a whole other reason because of how unification went, right? That's a whole other topic within itself, right? Unification went a particular way because of the people who led it, right? There could have been a more multicultural unification or accepting of regional identities and non-colonial projects through a kind of federalist risorgimento through people like Carlo Pascani, Giuseppe Ferrai in Milan. Pascani was from the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, right? So a lot of this stuff is also problematic positions towards race, towards diversity, etc., are also the conclusions of historical choices made at certain periods of time to choose to build a nation that's like this, right? To choose to build a society that's like this. So I think that's extremely important to talk about. And as we go on more, I'm more than happy to talk a little bit more about the diasporic experience, right? And the kind of racialization that happens with Italians in the diaspora.
Right wings in general, they always been very open about how close-minded they are and how conservative they are. And I think when things are so clear like that, you are able to decide or kind of like recognize if you are part of this or not. What I think is very ambiguous is most of the time the conversation that are happening inside the leftward. And specifically the Italian leftward, I come from that. I used to go to the squat, was the centro sociale, was the place where we all were coming together. And often we could see some diversity there. The conversations were very open. When I moved here, I actually recognized that here, because of Black, indigenous people of color, radicalism is still in act. Like there is still that kind of sense of left that I embrace, that I grew up with. I feel there is a huge lack of terminology in Italy for these kind of topics. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, when I understood what colorism is, among Caribbean people, South Americans people in particularly, but also, between biracial people here and Blacks, I felt, wow, this really remind me these problems that Italy has, which is like the hate between North and South. Intersectionality is a term that was translated from the political movements in America and Audre Lorde and all the black lesbians was translated in Italy early 90s. What I want to ask is also like, how can we empower this conversation and trying to enrich this situation where people seems to be colorblind, another term that people in Italy don't even know what it is. It seems that Italians, and I would say maybe, it's generalizing, European in general, but when I have conversations with them, in the United States, it seems that everything is a box checking, that the race and the racism is something that people enjoy to talk and they are obsessed with. There is an obsession about race. There is an obsession about, words that they are censored. So censorship in general. And there is not a recognition like between Black Americans, Latinx, and all that. Because people tend to say Americans and they refer to white Americans. So there is not a recognition of these groups and their existence. And I think they're bringing so much to the table in a political environment. But after George Floyd, people should be more open to receive those kind of informations. But there is a lot of resistance. So what can we do?